The global elites used the pharmaceutical industry to carry out the most brazen crime against humanity in history, according to former Pfizer Vice President and Chief Scientist Dr. Mike Yaden, who has blown the whistle about the depraved agenda of the globalist pharma nexus. Dr. Yaden previously presented evidence to prove that the COVID vaccines are bioweapons, used to further the depopulation agenda of the elite. But the COVID rabbit hole goes deeper than that, much deeper. According to Dr. Yaden, who spent decades as a senior executive at Pfizer and knows all of their dirty secrets, the COVID virus does not exist. And, wait for it, there is no evidence to prove that viruses exist at all. The COVID pandemic was nothing more than a globalist psyop to marshal humanity into an advanced state of mass formation psychosis, according to former Pfizer VP Dr. Yaden, who has joined a growing number of leading scientists who are speaking out about one of the greatest swindles ever pulled. The People's Voice broke the news that high-level German government documents prove that there was no COVID pandemic. There was no increase in hospital admissions for people with respiratory conditions. There was no increase in deaths before the COVID vaccine rollout. In fact, according to German government data, there was no pandemic at all, just a tightly choreographed military-grade psyop to brainwash the masses into accepting an experimental vaccine with disastrous consequences. As Dr. Yaden explains, there was no COVID pandemic, but the psyop led to the murder of millions, with a monstrous, long-planned attack on helpless civilians by coordinated, lethal central planning.
The powers that be, I'll call them the perpetrators, the people running this global crime. It is a global crime to take over all of humanity. Yeah. What they've done is they pretended that there was a serious new respiratory viral health threat. Okay, that's what they did, this virus in Wuhan. In my opinion, there never was there was never any new health threat whatsoever. Partly the beauty of this, it can't go wrong because there's no moving parts. There's literally the only moving part is the PCR test. So the initial thing, an exaggerated health threat. Now, some people believe there's a new virus, but if so, it's not any more serious than influenza, not really, because flu vanished at the same time by sheer coincidence. Personally, I actually have come to the conclusion, and I will credit Andrew Cowan and his colleagues. Yeah. I had a really good chat with those guys early in 2020, and it bothered me. I realized over time I could no longer maintain my understanding of respiratory viruses as I thought I knew them. And then I learned a new bit of information recently, and it collapsed the possibility that respiratory viruses as described exist at all. They don't. People do get ill. People are ill. People have exactly the same illnesses, Peter and your listeners, exactly the same illnesses as before that horrible heathen said viruses don't exist. They still have, quotes, colds and, quotes, flu. It's just, I think we don't know what causes them, and they're not respiratory viruses.
According to scientists at the forefront of the research, these people are not infected with viruses. There is simply no evidence that viruses actually exist. Freedom of Information requests reveal that health and science institutions around the world have no record of SARS-CoV-2 isolation or purifications anywhere ever. As Dr. Tom Cohen explains, if pathogenic viruses actually existed, it would be a simple task to isolate them and prove they exist. But the medical establishment is unable to do this.
During this past year, I have spent countless hours looking for evidence that these simple steps were done for the illness called COVID-19 and that the virus called SARS-CoV-2 was properly isolated and characterized. To my shock and surprise, neither I nor anyone else I know looking into this issue has yet to find a single published study that even attempted to perform these simple and doable experiments. To my further shock and surprise, I found that not only were these experiments not done with SARS-CoV-2, but they were also not done with AIDS, Hep C, measles, or any other illness supposedly caused by pathogenic viruses. As shocking as this may be to hear, I now ask that if you dispute this, please make available the paper or papers that successfully did these simple experiments.
So-called viral illnesses are simply the experience of the body detoxing. Viruses are not exogenous pathogenic entities. They are simply the inevitable breakdown particles of stressed and dead or dying tissues. This means they are not pathogenic for other individuals. They are not harmful to other beings. People cannot murder with their breath. So why are the elite and medical establishment determined to continue pushing the big lie about viruses? Because the global elite, in cahoots with the World Health Organization, have further nefarious plans for us. They understand that their weapons of mass destruction cannot be implemented without a terror campaign driven by the threat of a deadly virus. But we have news for them. We can prove that their deadly viruses are nothing to fear. While there is no evidence that viruses actually exist, and German government data reveals that nobody was actually dying of the so-called COVID virus, there is a mountain of evidence, both scientific and anecdotal, that prove that vaccines are causing carnage.
What about vaccine injury, the ones that actually took the shots? What did you see there?
Massive. I didn't know it was possible for a human to die so horrifically and so quickly before they rolled out the mRNA injections.
Dr. Mike Yaden said he has learned enough to say, "I think virology is wholly fraudulent." But he believes that people may be prevented from accepting any new information as a result of psychological protection mechanisms, which is why it can be hard to reach people without warnings. Dr. Yaden mentioned that a person confessed to him that they didn't want to believe what he was telling them because it was simply too frightening. This is what we are up against. Do not underestimate the power of the globalist psyop and mass formation psychosis. The stakes could not be higher, which is why dozens of leading research scientists are blowing the whistle about the corruption of the establishment and the virus scam. Dr. Sam Bailey joins us to explain why she joined the ranks of those standing up against the propaganda of the medical establishment.
As many of you are aware, a few weeks ago my husband Mark and I joined a group of 20 doctors and scientists who put their names to the Settling the Virus debate statement. Interestingly, this 2-page document appears to have acted like a hand grenade for some of the personalities in the health freedom movement. These individuals who believe that the existence of pathogenic viruses is an established fact have proceeded to lash out a bit. They've also attempted to distract from the central tenet of our statement, being that virology had failed to carry out scientifically controlled experiments. In reality, it is clear that the virologists have not shown that their techniques of, quote, viral cultures, genomics, and clinical diagnostics are valid even on their own terms. So let's have a look at what the statement is all about and why it is creating a few ripples. RNA or DNA, enclosed in a protein coat that can replicate only in a susceptible host cell. It has been more than 2 years since the onset of the corona crisis, which changed the trajectory of our world. The fundamental tenet of this crisis is that a deadly and novel virus, SARS-CoV-2, has spread around the world and negatively impacted large segments of humanity. Central to this tenet is the accepted wisdom that viruses, defined as replicating protein-coated pieces of genetic material, either DNA or RNA, exist as independent entities in the real world and are able to act as pathogens. That is, the so-called particle with the protein coating and genetic interior is commonly believed to infect living tissues and cells, replicate inside these living tissues, damage the tissues as it makes its way out, and in doing so is also believed to create disease and sometimes death in its host, the so-called viral theory of disease causation. The alleged virus particles are then said to be able to transmit to other hosts, causing disease in them as well. After a century of experimentation and studies, as well as untold billions of dollars spent towards this war against viruses, we must ask whether it's time to reconsider this theory. For several decades, many doctors and scientists have been putting forth the case that this commonly accepted understanding of viruses is based on fundamental misconceptions. Fundamentally, rather than seeing viruses as independent, exogenous pathogenic entities, these doctors and scientists have suggested they are simply the ordinary and inevitable breakdown particles of stressed and or dead and dying tissues. They are therefore not pathogens. They are not harmful to other living beings, and no scientific or rational reasons exist to take measures to protect oneself or others against them. The misconceptions about viruses appears to largely derive from the nature of the experiments that are used as evidence, to argue that such particles exist and act in a pathological manner. In essence, the publications in virology are largely of a descriptive nature rather than controlled and falsifiable hypothesis-driven experiments that are the heart of the scientific method. Perhaps the primary evidence that the pathogenic viral theory is problematic is that no published scientific paper has ever shown that particles fulfilling the definition of viruses have been directly isolated and purified from any tissues or bodily fluids of any sick human or animal. Using the commonly accepted definition of isolation, which is the separation of one thing from all other things, there is general agreement that this has never been done in the history of virology. Particles that have been successfully isolated through purification have not been shown to be replication competent, infectious and disease causing, hence they cannot be said to be viruses. Additionally, the proffered evidence of viruses through, quote, genomes and animal experiments derives from methodologies with insufficient controls. The following experiments would need to be successfully completed before the viral theory can be deemed factual. Number 1. A unique particle with the characteristics of a virus is purified from the tissues or fluids of a sick living being. The purification method to be used is at the discretion of the virologists, but electron micrographs must be provided to confirm the successful purification of morphologically identical alleged viral particles. Number 2. The purified particle is biochemically characterized for its protein components and genetic sequence. 3. The proteins are proven to be coded for by these same genetic sequences. 4. The purified viral particles alone, through a natural exposure route, are shown to cause identical sickness in test subjects by using valid controls. 5. Particles must then be successfully re-isolated through purification from the test subject at step 4 and demonstrated to have exactly the same characteristics as the particles found in step 1.
The medical establishment is running scared and can't prove the existence of viruses. But there's simply too much on the line for the elite to allow the bought and paid for research scientists to admit the truth. The virus fanatics at the WHO are continuing to use the 21st century version of the boogeyman to terrorize the masses into compliance. Dr. Tedros and his chief financier Bill Gates are using the threat of Disease X, or a bird flu pandemic, to convince the masses to support their diabolical plan to fleece nations of their sovereignty by signing the pandemic treaty. Future generations will look back at this time in history and marvel at the sheer brazenness of the global elite. We cannot allow them to succeed. We are living in unprecedented times, and here at TPV we are determined to expose the elite and hold them to account before it's too late.